The courtroom was packed with whispers, but the man in the wheelchair never said a word. He didn't have to, because when he lifted 2 fingers, just barely, his dog rose like a shadow, walked straight to the pastor on the witness stand, and pulled something out of his pocket that made the judge stop the trial cold. What that dog revealed. It turned the whole town upside down and exposed a truth nobody was ready to hear. The courthouse smelled like old varnish and stale coffee, and the benches creaked under the weight of restless townsfolk who had come not for justice, but for a spectacle. In the middle of it all sat Hank Mallory, a man the town once saluted, but now glared at like a ghost they wished would just vanish. His wheelchair gleamed in the morning sun streaming through stained glass windows, but his face was carved from granite, silent, unreadable. His hands, rough with time and scar tissue, rested on his lap, and beside him, unmoving, sat Rex, a 95-pound German shepherd with scars of his own and eyes that missed nothing. On the prosecution table, glossy photos showed blood, torn fabric, bite marks. They called it savage assault. But they didn't show the girl's face. They didn't show the tremble in her voice when she whispered to Hank that night, "Please don't let him take me back." No, they didn't want that part. The prosecutor stood tall in heels too clean for this town, painting Hank as a dangerous, broken veteran who let a war dog loose on a man of God. And the town believed her, because it was easier than asking hard questions. It was easier than admitting they might have been wrong about who their real monsters were. Nobody spoke to Hank during recess. No one looked him in the eye. They all watched Rex instead, waiting for him to slip. But the dog didn't move. He just stared ahead, steady, coiled, waiting. They thought they had this case won already. But what they didn't know was that the silence in that courtroom was not Hank's weakness. It was his weapon, and he was just waiting for the right time to use it. They say war ends when the guns fall silent, but that's a lie. Hank knew that better than most. His war never ended, it just changed shape. In '68, Hank had walked through jungle fires in Da Nang, watched boys become corpses in seconds, and learned the smell of burning fear. He led his men with a calm that made others trust him with their lives. But it didn't save his legs when a roadside mine caught them outside Hugh. They sent him home in a body bag that breathed. He woke up in a VA hospital, legs gone, voice torn from a collapsed windpipe, stitched and stapled and alone. Letters stopped coming. His sweetheart married someone else. His platoon scattered, some to cemeteries, others to bottles they never crawled out of. And Hank, he just drifted, invisible in a country that cheered parades but crossed the street when they saw his uniform. For decades, he lived off disability checks in silence, until one day, a rescue group called him about Rex, a military, working dog nobody wanted, too old to retrain, too scarred to adopt. They said he'd been in Iraq, sniffed IEDs, lost his handler to a mortar strike, then bounced from kennel to kennel like an old boot. Hank just said one word, send him. When Rex arrived, the dog didn't bark. He didn't wag. He just sat beside Hank and stared, like he recognized the wreckage behind the man's eyes. In the months that followed, they didn't need to talk. They just knew. Hank taught Rex the signs. A finger tap meant come. 2 taps, stay. A raised fist, guard. They trained like soldiers who'd never stop serving. And the silence between them? It wasn't emptiness. It was history. It was grief. And it was the one thing they had that no one else could understand. But soon, they'd learn that silence could also be the sharpest sword in a courtroom full of lies. Mill Creek used to throw parades for men like Hank, back when the wars were black and white and everyone knew who the enemy was. But time passed, banners faded, and gratitude got replaced with gossip. By the time Hank returned to settle just outside the edge of town, folks didn't see a hero anymore. They saw a grizzled loner with a war dog and a rusting pickup who kept to himself. They whispered stories about him at the diner, said he was paranoid, said he never spoke, said he buried weapons in his backyard. Truth was, Hank didn't care anymore. He'd found peace in quiet routine, early morning wheeling through gravel paths, patching fences for neighbors who didn't say thank you, leaving fresh bait for old-timers fishing on his land. He didn't ask for praise. He asked for space. But even that became too much. Kids started calling Rex the devil dog, daring each other to knock on Hank's door and run. Parents warned their kids to stay off his lawn. Churchgoers gave him cold glances as if trauma was contagious. But the final blow came when Pastor Silas Dalton took over the pulpit. A man wrapped in charisma and scripture. Silas was everything Hank wasn't: loud, admired, always smiling just a second too long. He made casual jokes about crazy war dogs during sermons, said some folks just couldn't let go of old violence. And the town laughed. They liked Silas. He was clean-cut, well-spoken, and prayed loudly at every meal. They didn't want to hear about his gambling debts or the teenage girls who suddenly left town without a word. They just wanted someone to believe in. And so, when the accusations came that Hank had attacked the pastor with a trained beast, they didn't ask why. They didn't ask how. They just nodded and said, "I always knew that man was trouble." Mill Creek didn't forget Hank. They erased him. That night, the wind howled like it remembered things the town wanted to forget. Hank was finishing a cup of instant coffee, the kind that tasted like war rations, when Rex's ears perked up. Then came the sound, a muffled whimper, barely louder than the wind, but sharp enough to slice through memory like shrapnel. Hank froze. Rex stood, staring at the window. Then it came again, a sob, raw and panicked, from the direction of the church across the street. Without thinking, Hank wheeled toward the door, fingers flicking a signal to Rex. Together they moved through the dark, past the dead mailbox, past the rusty gate, into the shadows. The church lights were on, but the sanctuary was empty. Hank circled around, heart pounding, and positioned himself near the basement window. What he saw burned into his brain. Pastor Silas, red-faced and snarling, gripping a teenage girl by the arm, dragging her across a cement floor. She was barefoot, her dress torn, her mouth duct-taped. Rex growled low. Hank gritted his teeth and pulled out his phone, recording. But the angle was bad. It was shadows, noise, panic, but not enough. Not enough for a sheriff who played poker with the pastor every Thursday night. Not enough to stop what was happening. The 911 dispatcher said they'd send someone tomorrow. Said there was no evidence of immediate harm. Hank wanted to scream, but his voice came out like sandpaper. He stared at the phone, the silence pressing on his chest like a coffin lid. He sat outside the church until sunrise, his jaw clenched, his dog never blinking. When morning came, he didn't sleep. He waited, because deep down, he knew this wasn't over. Not yet. The girl was still in there, and the town would never believe her. But they just might believe a dog. It was just after 10 a.m. when the knock came, sharp, hurried, the kind that made old soldiers reach for weapons they no longer carried. Hank opened the door to find her, the girl from the night before, trembling, bruises blossoming across her neck and arms, eyes red and empty. She didn't speak. She just looked at Hank like he was the last human being on earth who might understand what it was to be afraid. And he did. He moved aside. She stepped in. Rex nudged her gently with his nose and laid down beside her like a guardian from another life. Hank called Child Protective Services. This time, he didn't wait for protocol. While on hold, he boiled tea, wrapped her in an old marine blanket, and let the silence speak for him. But then came the storm. Pastor Silas, red with rage, burst through the front door like a demon dressed in faith. He accused Hank of kidnapping, of brainwashing, of desecrating the house of God. Hank tried to block him, but his chair snagged on the rug. In a heartbeat, Silas lunged. But before his fist could land, Rex moved, a blur of black and tan fur colliding with rage. He bit, not to injure, but to stop. And he did. Silas screamed like a wounded animal, stumbled backward as CPS officers stormed in, breaking the spell. But by then it was too late. The headlines came first. Veterans attack dog assaults local pastor. No mention of the girl. No mention of the bruises. Hank was arrested, charged, and tried in the court of public opinion before he even made bail. And the worst part? The girl vanished. Moved out of state, they said. No forwarding address. The DA said they couldn't find her. Said the case was now just Hank's word, and that of a dog. But Hank didn't argue. He didn't beg. He just waited in his cell, one hand on Rex's fur, and whispered the only command that mattered now. Watch. They called it an unprovoked assault, but the truth was locked inside a dog's memory and a girl's missing voice. When Hank was finally released on bail, the town didn't welcome him home. The same people who once slapped his back and offered him discounts at the hardware store now crossed the street when they saw him coming. He wasn't a veteran anymore. He was the villain, the mad recluse who set a war dog loose on a beloved pastor. And Rex? He wasn't a hero either. The papers called him dangerous, a liability, a ticking time bomb with fur. But what none of them understood was that Rex had never once failed an order, not in Iraq, not in Mill Creek, and not that day in the living room when the man who wore God's collar tried to harm a girl too scared to scream. Hank knew that if he'd commanded Rex to kill, the dog would have done it. But he hadn't. He gave the signal to protect. And Rex had obeyed, surgically and without rage. But none of that mattered now. The courtroom didn't want nuance. It wanted a clean story. Good versus evil. Silas, the hometown preacher with a gauze-wrapped arm and teary eyes, took the stand and painted himself as a victim of vigilante justice. Said Hank broke into his home. Said the dog bit him without warning. Said the girl, a runaway, troubled, lied to by a man too deep in his own war. And the jury believed every word. Because he smiled while he said it. Because he knew how to use silence, too. But his was a silence that hid rot, not honor. Hank's lawyer didn't ask the right questions. Didn't mention the girl's missing case file. Didn't even object when the judge excluded Hank's video footage as inconclusive. And so Hank sat there, listening to his character being shredded, knowing full well that truth had teeth, but only if someone let them show to be why the second week, the courtroom turned into a theater. The gallery was packed with townsfolk holding tight to coffee cups and colder judgments. Reporters camped outside, spinning their stories before hearing a word of testimony. Dog turns on pastor, they headlined. Veteran snaps. Nobody asked about the girl. Nobody asked why the sheriff had refused to investigate the first 911 call. Nobody asked why CPS had gone quiet. The judge was sharp, fair-eyed but cautious, the kind who weighed everything twice before speaking once. She watched Hank carefully, trying to decode his stillness, maybe wondering why a man who'd faced mortar fire wasn't blinking at public shame. And Rex? He sat stone still through it all, eyes never leaving the witness stand, posture alert but unmoving. He was more than a service dog now. He was a soldier again, waiting for the next command, reading the room with instincts honed in war zones. The prosecutor knew how to play the crowd. She dangled half-truths and smirks, referenced Hank's military records only to highlight his history of aggression, and called the dog a weapon disguised as a pet. Hank said nothing, but the way his hands moved, subtle, slow, methodical, told Rex everything he needed to know. Because buried in all this noise was a plan. A moment Hank was waiting for. A truth he was ready to unleash, not with speeches or shouting, but with something this courtroom couldn't ignore. The dog hadn't moved once in 8 days of testimony. But when he did, he'd speak louder than any man in the room. The final day of testimony arrived under a sky the color of gunmetal, gray, heavy, unwilling to break. Hank sat in his pressed flannel and worn slacks, unmoving. His lawyer leaned in, whispered, "It's not looking good." Hank didn't answer, because he didn't need to. He knew what was coming. Pastor Silas was back on the stand, voice syrupy, words lined with practiced righteousness. "I forgive Mr. Mallory," he said to the jury, "even after what he did to me, because God teaches mercy." The courtroom sighed in admiration. But something twitched inside Rex. A flick of the ear. A hard blink. Hank caught it. His fingers moved, barely a whisper of muscle memory. A closed palm. 2 fingers curled. A command they hadn't used in over a decade. Rex stood. The room gasped. The bailiff stepped forward. "Control your dog, Mr. Mallory." But the judge raised a hand. "Let him move." Rex walked slowly toward the stand, not aggressive, not fast, just deliberate. Like he knew the path was marked. Silas tensed, his eyes flashing panic. Rex sniffed his pant leg. Then his coat. Then, with surgical precision, he nudged his snout into the breast pocket of Silas's suit jacket and pulled. The fabric gave way, revealing a small flash drive dangling from a key ring. Rex dropped it on the floor and stepped back. Silence swallowed the courtroom. The judge leaned forward. "What is that?" Silas stammered. I don't know. I've never seen that." But the judge had already motioned for the bailiff. The drive was plugged in, and there it was. The girl, crying, pleading. The bruises. The voice. Her whisper. "He told me no one would believe me." The pastor lunged, screaming, "It's fake." But no one listened anymore. Truth had barked, and the whole world heard. The judge recessed the trial immediately. The footage was verified. CPS was subpoenaed. And then, like the final puzzle piece falling into place, the girl came back. She wasn't hiding anymore. She walked into that courtroom flanked by a retired judge and a child welfare advocate. Her face pale, but her eyes alive with fury. She looked at Silas and didn't blink. She told him everything. How he lured her under the guise of counseling. How he threatened her. How she ran. And how Hank, silent, scarred, discarded Hank, took her in without asking questions. "He didn't say much," she told the court, voice cracking. "But his dog looked at me like I was worth saving." Then she reached into her coat and held up something tiny. A bracelet, broken, smeared with dried blood. "He took this for me when I fought back. I saw it in his pocket before the dog pulled out that drive." She turned to Hank. "You saved my life." And then she knelt beside Rex and hugged him like he was the only thing that had kept her whole. The courtroom wept. Reporters stopped writing. The prosecutor sat back, mouth dry. The judge looked down from her bench and whispered, "Dismissed." All charges dropped. Then louder, "We will be pursuing criminal charges against Pastor Silas immediately." Hank didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He just reached down and touched Rex's head, his fingers trembling. Because they hadn't won anything. They'd simply survived. Together. The headlines exploded within hours. Veteran's dog exposes town secret. Service dog delivers justice. Silent hero speaks loud. Offers came in like floodwater. Morning shows, book deals, TV specials. But Hank said no. He always said no. Because this wasn't about fame. It was about making sure no one else felt voiceless again. Instead, he used the public donations and sympathy to start something that mattered, a non-profit called Rex's Haven, pairing retired military dogs with aging or disabled veterans, especially those who, like him, had been left behind. He bought an old barn on the edge of town, renovated it with volunteers, and turned it into a training center. Every week, broken men and loyal dogs met there to learn how to speak without words. Some of those men couldn't walk. Others couldn't sleep. Most had given up. But they all found something in those dogs that the world had forgotten how to offer. Trust without condition. And Hank? He never gave a long speech. He just showed up every morning, rain or shine, with Rex at his side. One fall day, a local elementary school invited him to speak. Veterans Week. Dozens of wide-eyed kids filled the room. Hank rolled to the center of the stage, cleared his throat, and said just one thing. "Justice doesn't always wear a badge," he rasped. "Sometimes it just wears fur." Then he looked at Rex, and the dog looked back, and the children clapped like they understood. And maybe they did. Because some truths don't need microphones. They just need to be seen. And as Rex laid down at his side, tail wagging softly, Hank finally smiled. Not for the cameras, but for the quiet, for the peace. For the girl whose voice they helped return, and for the man he used to be, buried beneath rubble, dug out not by war medals, but by loyalty.